I'm curious about why all these highly specific schools of martial arts developed, and MMA was so wildly novel so much later in history. Was no one ever a pragmatist? Really, this deserves its own incredibly well researched long form video, but I'm going to give it a shot sort of off the cuff. So, historically, martial arts have been divided into two camps. You've had those created for ritual combat or sport. Most of those have been various folk styles of wrestling. So, some form of grappling, the rules varied. We got a belt that we're supposed to grab, or we have a jacket we're supposed to grab, or, it only counts if you throw the guy on his back, or it counts if you can, make him touch the ground with his hands or his knees. The rules varied, but it was still pretty much, grab the guy and throw him, right? The other category would be what I'm going to refer to as combatives, and this was meant to supplement armed combat. I think this is where we get early forms of pugilism, and I mean pugilism across the board, not necessarily referring to like pre-Queensberry, English boxing. But if you think about how soldiers were generally fighting, you had a shield, you had a sword. So you used your front hand to block or to push or to grab, and use your rear hand to attack, with your sword or your axe or your spear or what have you. But that was, again, mostly confined to here's how we fight with weapons, so let's try the same thing without weapons. In the past, and I mean the relatively recent past, there was still very much a pragmatic approach to martial arts. One of the problems was that the things that sort of grew out of the combatives didn't really have a safe pressure testing format. We're often sort of caught up in this idea that, well, they use it in real battle, so it must be effective. Like, or maybe it wasn't. Like nobody won any wars with like spin kicks, right? People who had fought in battles took their training and they would teach, their family or, their village. I know that there are many family and village styles in China and I think Southeast Asia, but these were no longer battlefield styles. So we're learning like the hitting aspect to it, but we can't practice it in the way that we could practice boxing, basically. Let's throw things on our hands that aren't going to damage our hands or the other person's face if we practice hitting each other over and over, right? That didn't really exist. And I think largely because of that, systems that were not turned into sports, like we had in the West, we did have pugilism, and there are various forms of sport pugilism, in India, on the African continent, just in a lot of different places where strikes were incorporated in addition to throws or just by themselves. I mean, Muay Thai in its current form evolved out of a kind of pugilistic sport where, guys had their hands wrapped up in, I think it was rope, and we see that sort of in that region of Southeast Asia. But in a lot of other places, it was like, I don't know, hit the guy really hard, maybe it'll make his heart explode, and we see in places like China, Korea, Japan, Okinawa, hand conditioning, hitting wall bags, hitting striking posts, the idea that we're trying to make our fists like iron. But again, it's difficult to develop offensive and defensive skills when you cannot spar. Fast forward a little bit, you did have certain competitions in the late 1800s, early 1900s. In China, you had Li Tai competitions. So these were on raised platform. Striking was allowed. I think some grappling was allowed, maybe in the form of throws. and you could win by throwing the guy off of the platform. These were generally considered pretty dangerous. In Japan, you had different jiu-jitsu schools challenging one another. And again, these were considered very dangerous. There was like no point system. You didn't win with a single throw. Guys were going out there until somebody quit. The formats that we had in the early 20th century for Eastern martial arts were very rare, very dangerous, and sort of looked down upon depending on your region. Fast forward to, after World War II. Karate went from a very close-in fighting system in Okinawa, where you grab the guy and you hit him, to being influenced by the ideas from Kendo. So now we're doing like long-distance fighting where all I have to do is touch you, because I can't hit you because that would be too deadly. China has gone through, a civil war, World War II, another civil war, and the takeover of the communists, the Cultural Revolution, where they were like shunning all things old. In addition to like a lot of really authentic, legitimate martial arts being shut down, there was also an aspect of Chinese martial arts that were used for performance. So, you had the various opera companies where they were doing theatrical martial arts. You had street performers who were doing theatrical martial arts. And I think I strongly suspect this is maybe where we get in, some of like the animal styles or the drunken styles and things that on the surface don't look like real fighting. And probably some of the parlor tricks, you'll see guys like, holding their arm out and a guy will break a pole over their arm like, oh, and I'm not saying that doesn't require skill and discipline, but it's not the same thing as fighting. But a lot of people sort of think that even today. When things are coming over, in the 30s, 40s, 50s, we are not getting the martial arts as they were most martially practiced. And in addition, there are like elements of non-pragmatism to it. From Japan, after World War II, things are being trained as, cultural expressions or means of personal development. So it doesn't matter if this works in a fight, it matters if you can do it in a perfect way, because that will show your personal growth and development, right? So we're getting, talk about death touches and all that stuff is coming over. And of course there's, Orientalism going on and, the deadly mystic secrets of Tibet or whatever, right? So all that floods the West when it comes over, to varying degrees. There were always like legitimately tough people. There were always people who were teaching martial arts as a practical method of fighting. But a lot of the other stuff came over too, and, there were people who were attracted to that. So at that point, again, there are still certain pockets of pragmatism. Judo was a very specialized form of fighting, but it was still fighting. Like a judo person, if they grabbed you, was going to throw you, and could choke you and break your arm and all that. In karate, you had pockets of people training full contact. Kyokushin eventually came out. It wasn't quite as popular as some of the non-full contact styles, but luckily, in the West, we had people that began to train that stuff full contact, and that's how we got American kickboxing. And of course, you had the Kyokushin guys transitioning into kickboxing a bit and bringing that over to Holland and, really beginning like the Dutch kickboxing scene. So all this stuff sort of stayed around, in like the late 80s / early 90s, you had shoot fighting, which was, pro wrestlers who wanted to fight for real. So yes, by the time the UFC came around, it was rare to have full contact challenge matches, but there was always something like that around. Now, I think what mixed martial arts really did was it was the most open format that was available. So especially back in the early like Vale Tudo and No Holds Barred days, no biting and no gouging. Even if you do it, we're just going to like take some of your prize money away. We're not going to disqualify you. So, we got people who would throw headbutts and, people who would attack the groin. And, such an open format. And eventually it did become more sportified. As a quick aside, Shuto had a very sportified version of it, in the late 80s. If you were a wrestler, you could transition into mixed martial arts. If you did Taekwondo, you could transition into mixed martial arts. If you did kickboxing, you could transition into mixed martial arts. There was an opportunity for you to participate in this environment no matter what your background was. If you were a wrestler, you were probably not going to do kickboxing. If you were a boxer, you were probably not going to try your hand at something that, focused on grappling, right? So here's a format where you can do both. And I do think that we've seen how these different sides have sort of blended together. Guys are using, kickboxing to set up takedowns. They're using wrestling and, jiu-jitsu, positional stuff to pin the guy on the ground and then use striking to, lay in some ground and pound. So all this stuff is coming together. I think it's beautiful. I don't think it's the be-all, end-all, but it's a really great format for what it is. Pragmatism always existed. There are always going to be people who are okay doing their own things that are not pragmatic. You don't have to be focused on pragmatism to be involved in martial arts. People train for a number of different reasons. Some people train because they want to get more in touch with a certain culture as part of their heritage, perhaps. Some people like to do it as a form of exercise. I think it's best when people are self-aware enough. There's one guy that I encountered on a forum years ago. It's like, I do Shotokan because I like Shotokan. Those Muay Thai guys can beat me up. I got no problem admitting that, but I like Shotokan, so I'm going to stick with Shotokan because my goal isn't to be the best beater-upper. Martial arts isn't always about pragmatism, but there have been pockets that have focused on pragmatism throughout history. I hope that answers your question.